Leroy Jenkins was a preacher whose rise to prominence in the American South captivated congregations and drew the attention of national media. Born in 1938 in Mississippi, Jenkins grew up in a deeply religious environment, attending revival meetings and Sunday services that instilled in him a profound sense of spiritual purpose. Even as a young boy, he displayed an extraordinary ability to speak with authority and passion, captivating audiences with his voice, gestures, and intensity. By his early 20s, he had begun preaching in local churches, quickly earning a reputation for sermons that were both fervent and persuasive. In the 1960s and 1970s, Jenkins established his own ministry, positioning himself as a prophet of prosperity and divine blessing. His message was simple but compelling. God would reward faithful believers with wealth, health, and success, but contributions to his ministry were essential to unlocking those blessings. Jenkins' sermons blended scripture with motivational speech, urging followers to tithe generously and invest in the church's growth. Audiences were drawn to his promises, interpreting his words as divine guidance, a rare opportunity to gain favor with God through devotion and financial support. The ministry expanded rapidly. Jenkins built a network of satellite churches, hosted large-scale revival meetings, and began broadcasting on local television stations. His public persona exuded charisma, confidence, and moral authority. Followers described him as a spiritual father, someone who could provide both guidance and tangible blessings. Donations flowed steadily into the ministry, funding elaborate events, outreach programs, and, unbeknownst to congregants, a lavish personal lifestyle. Jenkins drove luxury cars, traveled extensively, and lived in a home far exceeding the modesty he preached about in public. Behind the scenes, Jenkins's operations were meticulously managed to maintain an image of righteousness and success. Financial records were complex and opaque, designed to shield the true allocation of funds from public scrutiny. Parishioners who questioned expenditures were often reassured with platitudes, spiritual admonitions, or personal attention, reinforcing the perception of Jenkins as a benevolent and divinely guided leader. The combination of trust, faith, and carefully curated appearances allowed Jenkins to operate without oversight for years, maintaining his position at the pinnacle of his religious community. Suspicion first arose when former staff and volunteers noticed inconsistencies in fundraising reports and charitable claims. Audits revealed that large sums of donated money, intended for community programs and church expansion, had been redirected to support Jenkins' personal ventures, including luxury purchases, real estate investments, and private travel. Investigators also discovered patterns of psychological manipulation, where followers were encouraged to give beyond their means with the promise of divine favor. The financial exploitation was deliberate, calculated, and bolstered by Jenkins' ability to inspire unquestioning trust. By the early 1980s, national attention turned toward Jenkins' ministry. Media reports documented the growing discrepancy between his public persona and the private reality of financial and spiritual manipulation. Congregants described feelings of betrayal and disillusionment, having believed they were participating in a sacred mission, while in reality their resources were funding a pastor's extravagant lifestyle. The scandal highlighted not only financial misconduct, but also the ethical consequences of exploiting spiritual authority. Legal authorities initiated investigations into tax violations, fraud, and misuse of charitable donations. Witnesses testified about the psychological pressure placed on church members, the cultivation of dependency, and the creation of fear around withholding contributions. Prosecutors demonstrated that Jenkins's sermons, outreach programs, and public acts of piety were part of a deliberate strategy to maintain trust and conceal the personal enrichment derived from donations. The evidence revealed a pattern of premeditated exploitation, showing how spiritual authority can be weaponized when unchecked. In 1985, Leroy Jenkins was convicted of multiple counts of fraud, misrepresentation, and tax evasion. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and ordered to repay significant sums to the defrauded congregants. The conviction shattered the ministry, dividing followers and leaving the community to grapple with the consequences of blind trust in a leader who had exploited their faith. Scholars of religion and psychology later examined Jenkins' case as a textbook example of how charisma, authority, and promises of divine blessing can be manipulated to extract resources from vulnerable communities. Reflection. The story of Leroy Jenkins is a stark illustration of how trust and faith, when placed in the hands of the unscrupulous, can be manipulated for personal gain. He promised prosperity, divine favor, and spiritual guidance, yet leveraged those promises to enrich himself at the expense of his congregation. For followers, the betrayal was profound. The pastor who had preached hope and salvation had instead delivered exploitation and loss. Jenkins' case serves as a chilling reminder that spiritual authority, while powerful, is not immune to corruption, and that vigilance and accountability are essential within faith communities to protect against such abuses. In the end, Leroy Jenkins' story is a cautionary tale that extends beyond one man's ministry. It is a lesson in human susceptibility to charm, authority, and the promise of divine reward. His fall from grace reminds us that even the most revered spiritual leaders can betray the very trust and faith they claim to nurture, leaving devastation, disillusionment, and painful questions in their wake. For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive. For years, Bishop Thomas Weeks III stood as a model of modern prosperity preaching. Polished, articulate, and sharply dressed, he led a growing congregation at Global Destiny Church in Duluth, Georgia, and reached national prominence through his marriage to fellow minister Juanita Bynum. Together, they presented a carefully crafted image of what they called kingdom partnership, a union of two anointed leaders whose relationship symbolized God's plan for marriage and ministry. Their sermons, televised across Christian networks, spoke of divine love, order, and mutual respect. To thousands of believers, they were the couple who proved that holiness and success could coexist. But behind the public unity, years of private tension and resentment were building. Members of their ministry would later recall moments of control, jealousy, and emotional strain. The pressure of leading a high-profile church and maintaining a brand of spiritual perfection left little room for imperfection. In August 2007, the polished facade shattered completely. On the night of August 21, 2007, in the parking lot of the Renaissance Concourse Hotel near Atlanta's airport, Juanita Bynum was attacked by Weeks after what witnesses described as a heated argument. A hotel employee intervened when he saw a man kicking and stomping a woman on the ground. The assault left Bynum bruised and shaken, and within hours, the story dominated national headlines. Police quickly issued a warrant for Weeks' arrest, and within days, the bishop who once preached about divine order turned himself in to authorities. The case gripped the public because both parties were well known in the faith community. Bynum was not just a pastor's wife. She was a prominent evangelist whose sermon, "No More Sheets," had inspired countless women to break free from cycles of pain and compromise. Her decision to speak openly about the assault transformed her into a symbol of courage for victims of domestic violence, especially within religious spaces that often encourage silence for the sake of reputation. During the investigation and subsequent court proceedings, Weeks denied many of the details but admitted to an altercation. He was charged with aggravated assault and terroristic threats, both serious felonies. In March 2008, rather than face a lengthy trial, he entered a guilty plea to a reduced charge of aggravated assault. The judge sentenced him to probation, community service, and ordered counseling. He also received court supervision to prevent any contact with Bynum without authorization. The fallout within the church community was immediate. Members of Global Destiny Church were divided. Some left in disillusionment, while others clung to the belief that their pastor could still be redeemed. Bynum's supporters emphasized that forgiveness could coexist with accountability, but the scandal forced a long overdue discussion about abuse within religious leadership. For many women in churches across the country, Bynum's decision to press charges publicly became a turning point in how faith communities addressed domestic violence. After sentencing, Weeks issued several public apologies and tried to frame the incident as a moment of personal failure and spiritual reckoning. He later launched smaller ministries, writing books about restoration and brokenness, yet the shadow of that night never lifted. The couple officially divorced in 2008, ending what had once been billed as a divine partnership. Years later, in interviews, Bynum reflected that she forgave Weeks but never excused his actions. Her openness about trauma and survival resonated with thousands, transforming her from a celebrity preacher into an advocate for healing. Weeks, for his part, expressed remorse and claimed to have rebuilt his life with humility. The story of Bishop Thomas Weeks III became a sobering reminder that even within sanctuaries built on faith, unchecked ego and anger can destroy everything they claim to protect. His downfall revealed how religious celebrity can mask private turmoil, and how the trappings of holiness can crumble in an instant when integrity gives way to control. In the years that followed, both continued to preach, though never together again. For observers, their saga left a difficult but necessary lesson, that spiritual authority does not guarantee moral discipline, and that no calling is immune to accountability. When Rulon Jeffs, leader of the FLDS Church, died in 2002, his son Warren took the pulpit as the prophet, inheriting control of one of America's most secretive and insular religious sects. From his base in the border towns of Colorado City, Arizona, and Hilldale, Utah, Jeffs commanded the devotion of thousands of followers who believed absolute obedience to him was the only path to salvation. He preached that the outside world was doomed, that government was evil, and that women were to be completely submissive. His followers handed over their property, wages, and even their personal autonomy. Jeffs controlled marriages, housing, and family structures through a theocratic hierarchy that left him unchallenged. To many in law enforcement and former member circles, it was less a church and more a totalitarian regime wrapped in scripture. By the mid-2000s, reports began surfacing from former FLDS members who described forced marriages, underage spiritual unions, and exile for anyone who questioned Jeffs' authority. Investigators in Utah and Arizona started gathering evidence, but the insularity of the community and the fear Jeffs inspired made witnesses scarce. He moved the church headquarters to a guarded compound in El Dorado, Texas, a 2,700-acre property called Yearning for Zion Ranch. In 2005, after indictments in Utah on charges of accomplice rape involving a 14-year-old girl, Jeffs disappeared. For more than a year, he was one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives, with his photo plastered across billboards nationwide. He was finally captured in August 2006 during a routine traffic stop near Las Vegas. Inside his Cadillac Escalade, officers found wigs, disguises, cell phones, and nearly $55,000 in cash, evidence that the prophet on the run had been living a double life of secrecy and control. Jeffs' first conviction came in 2007 in Utah, where he was found guilty as an accomplice to rape for arranging the coerced marriage between a 14-year-old girl and her 19-year-old cousin. The conviction was later overturned on a technicality, but more charges awaited. In 2011, a Texas jury found him guilty of sexually assaulting 2 underage girls he had taken as spiritual wives. Prosecutors presented audio recordings of Jeffs instructing his followers in disturbing rituals and tapes of the assaults themselves, which became decisive evidence. The court sentenced Jeffs to life in prison plus 20 years. Despite incarceration, he continued to issue directives to the FLDS community through letters and recorded messages, demanding loyalty and predicting divine punishment for the government. His followers, though fractured, remained devoted for years, convinced their prophet was suffering unjustly. Authorities who raided the Texas compound uncovered meticulous record-keeping that cataloged marriages between older men and dozens of underage girls, as well as vast financial ledgers showing how tithes funded Jeff's extravagant lifestyle. The revelations led to the seizure of Yearning for Zion Ranch and a wave of prosecutions against church officials. The downfall of Warren Jeffs forced the public to confront how isolation, authoritarian control, and misuse of Scripture can shield systemic abuse. Survivors described years of conditioning that made dissent seem like sin and obedience like salvation. For them, escaping meant losing not just a community, but an entire identity. Today, Jeffs remains in a Texas state prison, serving his life sentence, occasionally sending out handwritten proclamations that his followers post online. The FLDS Church has splintered, its population drastically reduced. Former members have built advocacy groups for survivors, and documentaries continue to examine the wreckage left behind. Warren Jeffs' story stands as one of the starkest modern examples of a preacher who turned faith into a tool of domination. He built a world where questioning him meant eternal damnation, and in doing so he demonstrated how absolute power, when cloaked in the language of prophecy, can become indistinguishable from tyranny. Jimmy Swaggart rose to national prominence as a Pentecostal preacher in the 1970s and 1980s, becoming one of the most recognized televangelists in America. Born in 1935 in Faraday, Louisiana, Swaggart was steeped in religious tradition from an early age. His father, a minister and singer, encouraged him in both preaching and music. By the 1960s, Swaggart was broadcasting sermons over radio and television, eventually establishing the Jimmy Swaggart Ministries, which attracted millions of viewers nationwide. His message emphasized personal holiness, opposition to sin, and the transformative power of faith. At the height of his influence, Swaggart was considered a moral authority for many Americans. He hosted Sunday broadcasts that combined music, preaching, and heartfelt appeals for donations, building a sprawling ministry funded by viewer contributions. Swaggart became a multimillionaire, owning television studios, ministry offices, and personal residences, all presented to the public as part of his work spreading the gospel. However, in 1988, Swaggart's public image was shattered. The LaSalle Parish Sheriff's Department in Louisiana discovered evidence that Swaggart had engaged in sexual activity with a prostitute. The investigation was prompted by a report from the woman herself, who later corroborated her encounter with Swaggart. When confronted, Swaggart initially denied the allegations, but under mounting pressure, he admitted to moral failings in a televised confession. The scandal became front-page news, dominating newspapers and television broadcasts. Swaggart's televised ministry took an abrupt hit as supporters struggled to reconcile his preaching with the revelation of personal misconduct. During a nationwide broadcast, he tearfully admitted his sin, pleading for forgiveness from his congregation and the broader Christian community. The emotional fallout was immense. Donations to the ministry declined sharply, and longtime followers either left the church or wrestled with disillusionment. Beyond the sexual scandal, investigators began scrutinizing the financial operations of Swaggart's ministry. While there was no criminal conviction for financial misconduct, reports revealed that the ministry had accumulated millions in donations, prompting public questions about accountability, oversight, and the proper use of religious funds. Critics argued that Swaggart's case demonstrated the risk of concentrated power in religious ministries with little transparency. The scandal also triggered a broader conversation about televangelism in the United States. Swaggart's peers, including Jerry Falwell, Oral Roberts, and Jimmy Bakker, were also under public scrutiny for financial and moral misconduct, prompting calls for accountability and regulation within religious broadcasting. Many evangelical leaders argued that Swaggart's confession, while humbling, could not fully restore public trust. In the years following the scandal, Swaggart attempted to rebuild his ministry. He returned to broadcasting, continued music performances, and authored books about repentance and spiritual struggle. While he regained a degree of following, the shadow of his 1988 scandal never fully lifted. For millions who had once viewed him as an unassailable moral authority, Swaggart's fall remains a cautionary tale of how charisma, power, and celebrity can mask vulnerability and human weakness. The story of Jimmy Swaggart exemplifies the intersection of faith, fame, and failure. His rise demonstrated the power of televised religion to inspire and unify, while his fall revealed how unchecked authority and the pressures of public ministry could lead to devastating consequences. The scandal forced congregations, churches, and regulators to confront the reality that even prominent spiritual leaders are accountable for both moral conduct and transparency in financial stewardship. Ultimately, Swaggart's legacy is complex. He is remembered for his contributions to music and preaching, yet his name is equally associated with moral failure. For historians, sociologists, and religious scholars, the Swaggart case offers enduring lessons about the vulnerability of spiritual authority, the dangers of concentrated influence, and the lasting impact of public scandal on communities of faith. Jim Bakker was a man whose name became synonymous with televangelism in the late 20th century. To millions of viewers across America, he was a charismatic preacher, a master of fundraising, and a visionary who promised spiritual guidance, prosperity, and a sense of belonging to those who tuned in to his broadcasts. His ministry, the PTL Club, short for Praise the Lord, grew rapidly during the 1970s and 1980s, blending religious fervor with cutting-edge television production, theme park ventures, and a promise of salvation that seemed both urgent and attainable. Bakker's rise to fame was meteoric, and his influence reached beyond churches into living rooms, hotel lobbies, and the consciousness of millions who believed in his message. Born in 1940 in Muskegon, Michigan, Bakker was raised in a deeply religious household and quickly discovered a talent for public speaking and persuasion. By his early 20s, he was already preaching in small churches, but it was his partnership with fellow minister Tammy Faye Bakker that would catapult him into national prominence. The Bakkers married in 1961, blending personal devotion with professional ambition. Together they built a television empire, producing programs that combined heartfelt preaching, musical performances, and calls for donations that emphasized both spiritual commitment and the tangible rewards of giving. The PTL Club was more than a show. It was a phenomenon. Viewers were encouraged to send money to support the ministry, often with the promise of blessings, miracles, or divine favor. The funds were also used to build Heritage USA, a Christian theme park and resort that included hotels, studios, and recreational facilities. Visitors and followers were told that by participating, they were part of a grand spiritual mission, a chance to invest in God's work on earth. The operation seemed impeccable, professional, and above reproach. Jim Bakker presented himself as a man of faith, integrity, and vision, someone whose mission transcended personal gain. However, beneath the polished veneer lay a growing web of deception. Investigations eventually revealed that Bakker and key associates had engaged in financial misconduct, including misappropriation of funds, overstatement of assets, and fraudulent accounting practices. Tens of millions of dollars were diverted from the ministry to support personal extravagance, political campaigns, and business ventures that were misrepresented to donors. Church leaders and auditors began to uncover discrepancies, though Bakker's charm and influence often delayed accountability. The scandal reached its peak in 1987, when it became publicly known that Bakker had been involved in a scheme to conceal payments to a former church secretary who had accused him of sexual misconduct. The revelation compounded the existing financial controversies, igniting a media frenzy and triggering legal investigations. National news outlets scrutinized the ministry, Heritage USA, and the personal lives of the Bakkers, revealing that the empire built on faith, donations, and trust had been underpinned by deception, fraud, and abuse of authority. Federal authorities launched an exhaustive investigation into PTL's finances. Prosecutors documented a pattern of misrepresentation and concealment, showing how funds intended for charitable and religious purposes had been redirected for personal gain. Witnesses described a culture in which questioning Bakker's authority was discouraged and dissenters were marginalized. Financial records, internal memos, and corroborating testimony painted a portrait of an operation that exploited the trust of millions, leveraging spiritual authority for profit. In 1989, Jim Bakker was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison and ordered to pay millions in restitution, though the sentence was later reduced to 8 years on appeal. The legal proceedings were highly publicized, revealing not just the mechanics of the fraud but the human toll. Thousands of donors felt betrayed, employees faced public scrutiny, and the Bakkers' once celebrated ministry was left in ruins. Heritage USA was sold, the television program ended, and the PTL brand became a cautionary tale in religious broadcasting. Bakker served several years in prison, and upon release he re-emerged in ministry and broadcasting, though his reputation remained tarnished. Scholars, journalists, and ethicists have analyzed his case as a study in charisma, authority, and moral failure. Bakker's story illustrates the complex interplay between faith, trust, and financial temptation, highlighting how even the most public and celebrated religious figures can exploit belief for personal enrichment. Reflection. The story of Jim Bakker is a stark reminder that power and trust, when combined with charisma, can be manipulated to devastating effect. Millions were inspired, moved, and ultimately betrayed by a man who presented himself as a servant of God while enriching himself and concealing misconduct. His fall demonstrates how carefully constructed illusions of virtue can mask profound ethical and legal violations, leaving communities of faith to grapple with betrayal, disillusionment, and the painful realization that spiritual leaders, like anyone else, are capable of deception. In the end, Bakker's empire collapsed, not because of lack of faith among the faithful, but because the very trust he cultivated was weaponized against those who believed in him. He promised salvation, prosperity, and divine favor, but delivered scandal, legal judgment, and a haunting lesson in the fragility of trust when faith is exploited for personal gain. Billy Estes was a man who understood the allure of power, money, and charisma long before he entered the world of ministry. Born in 1925 in rural Texas, he came from modest beginnings but quickly demonstrated a keen intellect and an uncanny ability to persuade others. By the 1950s and 60s, he had built a reputation not just as a businessman, but as a man who could make the impossible seem real. A man whose vision promised wealth and prosperity to anyone willing to trust him. His skills in manipulation and showmanship would eventually make him one of the most infamous figures in American televangelism, blending the promise of divine blessing with a mastery of deception. Estes first rose to prominence through a combination of agricultural schemes and business ventures. He exploited loopholes in federal farm programs, convincing lenders and investors to back ventures that appeared legitimate but were built on fraudulent contracts and fabricated inventories. His charm, persuasive speech, and ability to present numbers in a convincing manner allowed him to pull off complex schemes that defrauded banks, government programs, and individual investors alike. Local communities marveled at his apparent success, unaware that the empire they admired was built on lies, misrepresentation, and cunning manipulation. By the late 1950s, Estes had intertwined his business acumen with religious messaging, presenting himself as a man blessed by God to prosper and, by extension, to bring blessings to those who followed him. He leveraged the growing reach of television to broadcast messages that promised wealth, success, and divine favor to those who contributed to his ministries or invested in his ventures. The line between faith and finance became increasingly blurred. His congregation was encouraged to believe that financial support was not merely charitable, but a sacred act that would ensure personal prosperity. People sent money, purchased shares in ventures he promoted, and attended his sermons with the belief that God had singled out Estes as a man capable of delivering miracles in wealth and opportunity. However, the facade could not last forever. Investigative reporters, law enforcement officials, and auditors began to uncover the intricate web of deception underlying Estes's empire. Contracts were fraudulent, inventories non-existent, and money from investors and congregants alike was being diverted to fuel his own lavish lifestyle. He had constructed a carefully managed illusion, a man of faith, a prophet of prosperity, a successful businessman, all designed to mask the reality of a carefully orchestrated fraud. By 1962, Estes's schemes had drawn the attention of federal authorities. A high-profile investigation revealed that he had engaged in multiple counts of fraud, including falsifying warehouse inventories, misrepresenting the value of commodities, and deceiving lenders into financing non-existent assets. The scope of his deception was staggering. Millions of dollars had been obtained under false pretenses, and the victims included ordinary farmers, banks, and religious communities who had trusted him implicitly. The trial that followed became a national spectacle. Estes's charm, courtroom theatrics, and relentless confidence were on full display as he attempted to convince jurors, reporters, and the public that he was a victim of circumstance rather than a perpetrator of sophisticated fraud. Witnesses recounted how he had exploited their faith, presented false contracts as legitimate, and encouraged individuals to invest in ventures that existed only in his imagination. Auditors and investigators detailed the meticulous planning required to sustain the deception, highlighting the combination of psychological manipulation, financial trickery, and exploitation of trust that had allowed Estes to operate for years without scrutiny. Ultimately, the court found Estes guilty on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. He was sentenced to decades in federal prison, his empire dismantled, and his name forever associated with one of the most audacious schemes of mid-20th century America. For those who had believed in him, the betrayal was profound. Congregants, investors, and followers who had trusted in both his spiritual and financial guidance were left grappling with the realization that a man they had considered divinely inspired had instead used their faith and trust to enrich himself. Yet even from prison, Estes's legend endured. Scholars of religion, finance, and psychology would later examine his case as a study in the exploitation of authority. His ability to blend religious messaging with financial manipulation illustrated the potent combination of charisma, trust, and promise that could sway entire communities. His story serves as a cautionary tale that faith can be weaponized, trust can be commodified, and even a man who appears to act as a conduit of divine blessing can be motivated entirely by self-interest. Reflection. The story of Billy Saul Estes is a stark reminder of how easily power, faith, and ambition can intersect to create deception on a massive scale. He promised prosperity and divine favor, yet delivered manipulation and financial ruin. He leveraged the desire of millions for hope and security, creating a world in which the lines between faith and fraud were indistinguishable. In the end, Estes's life forces us to ask a haunting question. When the promise of heaven is mixed with the lure of wealth, who is really leading and who is being led? For those who followed him, the answer was devastating. The prophet they trusted had never been sent by God. He had been sent by his own ambition, and the millions who believed were left to confront the consequences of blind faith in a man whose words had been as empty as the warehouses he claimed to own. Chris Vallotton, co-lead of Bethel Church in Redding, California, rose to prominence in the early 1990s alongside Pastor Bill Johnson. Known for his charismatic preaching, spiritual teaching, and prolific writing, Vallotton became a key figure in the modern charismatic movement, attracting a global audience of followers who admired Bethel Church for its focus on revival, miracles, and prophetic ministry. Vallotton's public persona was that of a spiritual father, counselor, and guide, blending motivational teaching with traditional evangelical principles. Under Vallotton's leadership, Bethel Church grew exponentially. Its services drew thousands, its music ministry reached millions online, and its associated schools and ministries expanded globally. Followers viewed Vallotton as a source of spiritual insight, particularly regarding personal development, marriage, and prophetic guidance. Donations to the church poured in, funding a wide array of ministries, international missions, and educational programs. Vallotton's books and teachings became staples in the modern charismatic community, cementing his influence across generations. However, by the mid-2010s, cracks began to appear beneath the polished surface of Bethel's public image. Investigative reports and whistleblower accounts raised concerns about financial transparency, leadership accountability, and handling of misconduct. Critics noted that while Bethel had amassed millions in donations, financial oversight was limited, and internal checks on senior leaders were minimal. Vallotton himself faced public scrutiny for personal choices, lifestyle, and his handling of sensitive issues involving staff and congregants. The controversies escalated in 2018 when reports emerged of financial mismanagement within Bethel's affiliated nonprofits, including questionable use of donor funds and high-risk property acquisitions. Some former members alleged that spiritual authority was used to influence financial giving, creating pressure to contribute beyond personal means. While no criminal convictions were issued, these reports prompted national attention and debate about the ethical responsibilities of megachurch leaders, particularly those wielding significant influence over vulnerable or impressionable followers. Alongside financial scrutiny, Vallotton faced questions about moral accountability and church culture. Investigative journalism highlighted concerns regarding the handling of internal complaints and allegations of misconduct. Although Bethel maintained that it followed proper protocols, former congregants argued that the hierarchy's influence often discouraged questioning of senior leaders. creating an environment where accountability was complicated by reverence for spiritual authority. Despite the controversies, Vallotton continued to preach, teach, and publish widely. His messaging emphasized spiritual growth, prophecy, and divine purpose, appealing to followers who remained loyal. Bethel Church, meanwhile, maintained a robust global presence, with music, conferences, and online content reaching audiences far beyond its Reading campus. Yet for many observers, the Vallotton case symbolizes the delicate balance between charismatic leadership and organizational transparency. The story of Chris Vallotton and Bethel Church underscores the challenges inherent in modern megachurches. The combination of spiritual authority, financial influence, and personal charisma can create both opportunity and risk. While many followers report genuine spiritual growth and inspiration, the scrutiny of leadership practices demonstrates the importance of ethical accountability. For analysts and religious scholars, Vallotton's experience provides a cautionary tale. Leadership in faith-based organizations carries both immense responsibility and the potential for controversy. Communities, donors, and congregants are reminded that faith should not eclipse due diligence, and that even revered leaders can face legitimate scrutiny without undermining the core spiritual mission. Ultimately, Vallotton's story is less about criminality than about the complex intersection of power, trust, and human imperfection in religious institutions. It forces reflection on how congregations navigate the tension between reverence for leaders and the necessity of transparency, ethics, and oversight. Lessons that resonate far beyond a single megachurch. Robert Tilton was born in 1946 in Dallas, Texas. From humble beginnings, he rose to national prominence as a charismatic preacher whose ministry promised financial prosperity and spiritual breakthrough to anyone who followed his teachings. Tilton's message was emblematic of the burgeoning prosperity gospel movement. Faith, he preached, was not just about salvation, but also about success in health, career, and wealth. Those who gave generously to God's work, he claimed, would see blessings returned manifold. By the early 1980s, Tilton had launched Success and Life, a nationally televised ministry that broadcast across hundreds of cable channels in the United States. His production style combined impassioned preaching, dramatic testimonies, and compelling calls for viewer donations. He encouraged followers to mail in financial pledges and seed offerings, promising that God would reward their faith with miraculous provision. Tilton's audience grew rapidly, and his program became a cultural phenomenon. Millions of viewers watched weekly as he prayed for healing, delivered messages of hope, and asked for contributions to expand his ministry. Tilton's rise was meteoric. He purchased lavish homes, exotic cars, and built his ministry empire in Texas. Donations poured in from working-class Americans who believed their money would fund God's work. Tilton presented a narrative of divine abundance, God's blessing flowing through the ministry and returning to those who gave faithfully. Behind the camera, however, Tilton's financial empire was structured in ways that ensured that most of the money flowed to the preacher and his organization, rather than charitable or community projects. In the late 1980s, investigative journalists began scrutinizing Tilton's ministry. Inside Edition conducted one of the first high-profile exposés, sending undercover crews to examine his prayer line operations. The investigation revealed a system in which staff members would sift through letters sent by viewers requesting prayer, mark those that contained financial pledges, and ensure that those offerings were processed before any genuine spiritual care was provided. This revelation created national outrage. The broadcast accused Tilton of exploiting the vulnerable, particularly sick, elderly, and desperate individuals who were writing to him in faith and hope. The legal repercussions followed. In 1991, the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, filed a complaint against Tilton's ministry, accusing it of deceptive practices in the solicitation of donations. The FTC argued that while the ministry claimed to pray for all who wrote in with requests, the system disproportionately prioritized those who included financial contributions. Tilton's organization agreed to a settlement requiring increased transparency in its fundraising methods and mandated that all contributions be used in accordance with donor intent. The case highlighted the blurry line between spiritual guidance and financial exploitation, emphasizing the need for accountability in televangelist operations. Tilton also faced internal challenges. Following the media exposés and legal action, donors and followers began questioning his integrity. Several high-profile congregants and board members resigned in protest. Congregational attendance declined, and the once booming Success and Life network began to lose its reach. Despite public apologies and statements asserting his faithfulness and devotion, Tilton's credibility suffered a significant blow. Critics accused him of hypocrisy, preaching prosperity and divine favor while amassing immense personal wealth. Even after the scandal, Tilton attempted comebacks. He launched new television programs, adapted his message for online streaming platforms, and continued to solicit donations under revised guidelines. He argued that his teachings remained rooted in Scripture and that his financial transparency had improved. While he maintained a smaller but devoted following, Tilton's story became a case study in the risks of unregulated religious media, raising ethical questions about charismatic authority and the accountability of televangelists. Beyond the financial scandals, Tilton's case sparked broader discussions about religious exploitation. Scholars, journalists, and regulators analyzed the psychological mechanisms at work, how the promise of divine favor could influence giving behavior, how charismatic authority could override skepticism, and how institutional oversight could prevent or enable abuse. Tilton's operations exemplified a system in which the veneer of faith masked a sophisticated, high-volume fundraising enterprise that relied on both trust and emotional appeal. The fallout affected not just Tilton but the prosperity gospel movement itself. Other ministries faced increased scrutiny from media and regulators, and some implemented stricter accounting practices. Donors were encouraged to exercise caution and demand transparency. Seminaries and theological schools began discussing the ethical dimensions of fundraising and financial accountability in ministry, using Tilton's case as a cautionary example. Tilton's personal life mirrored his public controversies. He married multiple times, faced questions regarding his personal conduct, and dealt with internal church disputes over authority and governance. While not all allegations were criminal, they added to a narrative of a preacher whose public persona of spiritual leadership was complicated by private ambition and questionable ethical decisions. By the 2000s, Tilton's empire had diminished significantly. His ministry continued to broadcast, but no longer wielded the same cultural influence it had in the 1980s. Documentaries, books, and investigative reports revisiting his career emphasized lessons about charisma, financial power, and the vulnerability of congregants. For many former followers, Tilton's story is a mix of admiration for his inspirational rhetoric and regret for the exploitation they experienced, a duality that underscores the complex nature of power in religious leadership. The story of Robert Tilton serves as a cautionary tale about the intersection of faith, media, and money. It demonstrates how unchallenged authority, when combined with mass communication and the promise of spiritual reward, can lead to ethical lapses and widespread public harm. Tilton's rise and fall continue to influence conversations about accountability, transparency, and the responsibilities of religious leaders in managing both spiritual and financial trust. Reflection. Tilton's saga leaves an enduring question for audiences and scholars alike. How much power should one person hold over the faith and finances of millions? His story underscores that trust, once betrayed, reverberates across communities, and that charisma alone cannot substitute for ethical stewardship and integrity in positions of spiritual authority. Eddie Lee Long was born in 1953 in Charlotte, North Carolina, and raised in a working-class family. From a young age, he was drawn to the church, where he developed both a deep sense of religious conviction and an extraordinary gift for public speaking. By the time he entered seminary, Long had already begun to envision a ministry that would reach thousands. His charisma, authoritative preaching style, and compelling personal story enabled him to connect with congregants on a personal and spiritual level. After completing his education at Norfolk State University and later theological training, Long began his pastoral career in modest churches before founding New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Decatur, Georgia, in the 1980s. Under his leadership, New Birth grew rapidly, transforming from a small congregation into a sprawling megachurch attracting tens of thousands of attendees each week. Long emphasized messages of prosperity, success, and personal empowerment alongside spiritual devotion. He preached that faith and obedience to God could manifest not only spiritual blessings but tangible, material success. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Long had become one of the most prominent religious figures in the United States. His sermons were broadcast nationally, and he cultivated relationships with political leaders, celebrities, and influential figures in the African American community. New Birth Missionary Baptist Church expanded its campus, acquiring massive facilities, media operations, and affiliated schools. Long himself acquired considerable wealth, including luxury homes, private jets, and high-end vehicles, all framed as evidence of God's favor for a faithful servant. However, beneath the polished exterior of success, serious allegations began to surface. In 2010, 4 young men, all former members of New Birth, filed lawsuits claiming that Bishop Long had sexually coerced and manipulated them over a period of years. The men alleged that Long used his position of authority and spiritual influence to pressure them into sexual relationships, exploiting their trust and the hierarchical structure of the church. While the allegations did not involve overt publicized violence, the claims pointed to a profound abuse of spiritual and institutional authority, a betrayal of trust that reverberated throughout the community. The lawsuits became national news, drawing widespread media attention and prompting intense scrutiny of Long's ministry. He initially denied wrongdoing, describing the accusations as attempts to tarnish his reputation and destabilize the church. Legal experts noted that the complexity of the cases, coupled with the powerful position Long held in his community, presented significant challenges for investigators and plaintiffs alike. Public reaction was mixed. Some congregants defended their bishop passionately, insisting on his integrity and spiritual authority, while others were shocked and disillusioned by the allegations. During this period, several financial and administrative controversies within New Birth also came to light. Reports indicated that church funds had been used to support Long's lavish lifestyle and to settle previous allegations discreetly. While these financial arrangements did not result in criminal charges, They contributed to a growing perception that the church's hierarchical power structure allowed a single individual to wield near absolute control over congregants' spiritual and personal lives. In 2011, after months of legal negotiation, Long reached confidential settlements with the plaintiffs, avoiding a public trial. The terms were not disclosed, but the resolution ended the litigation while leaving questions about accountability, transparency, and institutional oversight unresolved. For the victims, the settlement provided financial recognition, but not necessarily closure or validation in the public eye. Despite the scandals, Long attempted to maintain his ministry. He returned to preaching, emphasizing forgiveness, repentance, and restoration, while continuing to manage New Birth's operations. However, the damage to his reputation was irreversible. Attendance declined, and former congregants publicly criticized the church for failing to protect young men from abuse. Media commentary framed Long's case as emblematic of the broader vulnerabilities inherent in megachurch hierarchies, particularly when charismatic authority goes unchecked. Long's health also became a topic of public discussion. In 2016, at age 63, he passed away from an aggressive form of cancer. His death closed a chapter on one of the most controversial figures in modern American religious life, leaving behind a ministry with both devoted followers and a legacy of skepticism and controversy. His death did not erase the pain experienced by the victims nor the questions raised about institutional safeguards within large churches. For sociologists and scholars of religion, Eddie Long's story highlights the intersection of charisma, power, and vulnerability within faith-based organizations. His life illustrates how spiritual authority can be leveraged to inspire both devotion and, in some cases, manipulation. The case prompted conversations about safeguards for young members, ethical leadership, and the importance of independent oversight within megachurch environments. Beyond the immediate legal and organizational implications, Long's case resonated culturally. It fueled national debates on the accountability of religious leaders, the ethics of prosperity preaching, and the responsibilities of congregants and church boards in monitoring the actions of senior clergy. Survivors and advocates have since used Long's case to push for reforms and to encourage other victims to come forward, emphasizing that spiritual leadership should never be a shield for abuse or exploitation. The story of Eddie Long remains both a cautionary tale and a lens through which to examine the complex dynamics of modern faith leadership. It underscores the dangers inherent when concentrated authority is coupled with wealth, influence, and personal charisma. Trust, once invested, can be profoundly violated when accountability structures fail, and the ripple effects are felt across communities, families, and generations. Reflection. Eddie Long's rise and fall challenge audiences to consider the human cost of unbridled power within religious institutions. His life illustrates that moral authority is not inherent to titles, and that even revered spiritual figures can exploit trust when systems fail to protect the vulnerable. The case remains a stark reminder of the need for transparency, oversight, and vigilance in institutions that wield influence over both faith and daily life. Maciel de Golado was born in 1920 in Cotaja, Michoacán, Mexico, and would go on to establish one of the most powerful and secretive religious orders in the modern Catholic Church, the Legionaries of Christ. From an early age, Maciel displayed a magnetic personality, combining charm, intelligence, and relentless ambition. He was ordained as a priest in 1944 and quickly began attracting followers, presenting himself as a devout servant of God who could inspire generations of clergy and laity alike. In 1941, Maciel founded the Legionaries of Christ, an order committed to strict discipline, rigorous theological training, and an aggressive approach to evangelization. By the 1960s, the Legion had grown internationally, establishing schools, seminaries, and charitable organizations across Europe, North America, and Latin America. Maciel positioned himself as the spiritual father of the order, centralizing control and demanding absolute obedience from both priests and seminarians. The Legion became known for its impressive fundraising, political influence, and elite educational institutions, attracting families who wanted their children trained in what was portrayed as a path of moral and spiritual excellence. However, beneath the surface of religious zeal and organizational growth, Maciel led a life marked by deception, manipulation, and predatory behavior. Multiple allegations emerged over decades, claiming that Maciel had sexually abused seminarians, exploited minors, and coerced young men into illicit relationships. His position of power, combined with his reputation as a holy and disciplined priest, enabled him to operate with near impunity for decades. Witnesses later testified that fear, manipulation, and loyalty to the order prevented victims from speaking out, while parents and superiors trusted his public image over private reports. The first serious accusations became public in the 1990s, when former Legion members and investigative journalists began documenting patterns of abuse. Victims described Maciel as a man who used spiritual authority to control their lives, often framing sexual acts as tests of obedience or divine favor. Internal church investigations were slow and hesitant. Maciel's influence in Rome, combined with the Legion's impressive network of supporters, shielded him from immediate accountability. Many believed he was untouchable due to his connections and the charisma he wielded over influential clergy and laity alike. Maciel's abuse was extensive and systematic. He reportedly engaged in predatory behavior with both minors and seminarians over decades, using psychological manipulation, intimidation, and promises of spiritual reward to silence victims. His dual life, publicly a model priest and privately a predator, was meticulously maintained, with those who attempted to question his authority facing ostracization or threats. For years, the Legionaries of Christ presented themselves to the world as a model Catholic organization, while internal mechanisms protected Maciel from scrutiny. By the early 2000s, pressure from victims, investigative journalists, and concerned clergy became impossible to ignore. Pope John Paul II had initially supported Maciel, lauding him as a model priest and lauding the Legion for its contributions to the Church. However, mounting evidence and persistent complaints eventually forced the Vatican to act. In 2006, following extensive investigation, Maciel was officially disciplined by the Holy See. He was ordered to retire to a life of prayer and penance, stripped of public ministry and barred from any contact with seminarians. Despite the Vatican's actions, the damage was profound. The Legionaries of Christ faced global scrutiny, as former members and parents revealed the extent of Maciel's abuses and the organizational cover-ups that allowed him to continue unchallenged for decades. The Church undertook significant reforms within the Legion, including the appointment of external oversight, restructuring leadership, and implementing policies to protect minors and ensure accountability. Victims finally began to speak publicly without fear of reprisal, sharing stories that underscored the systemic failures of both the order and the broader church hierarchy. Maciel died in 2008 at the age of 87, leaving behind a legacy of wealth, influence, and scandal. While the Legionaries of Christ survived as an organization, its credibility and moral authority were deeply shaken. Global media coverage chronicled the decades of abuse, the deception, and the extraordinary lengths to which Maciel went to maintain his image. Historians, theologians, and sociologists have since analyzed his life and ministry as a case study in how charisma, hierarchical authority, and institutional loyalty can enable systemic abuse. The aftermath of Maciel's scandal prompted widespread reflection within the Catholic Church. Seminaries and dioceses implemented new safeguarding policies, financial transparency rules, and reporting mechanisms for misconduct. The Vatican emphasized accountability for leaders at all levels, recognizing the need to protect vulnerable populations and prevent charismatic authority from being abused. Survivors have since become advocates, using their experiences to push for reform, transparency, and justice. Maciel's story illustrates the destructive potential of unchecked religious authority. It reveals how a single individual, operating behind a veneer of holiness and organizational success, can exploit trust and manipulate entire communities for decades. For observers, it demonstrates the necessity of vigilance, oversight, and ethical accountability in all institutions, religious or otherwise. Reflection. Maciel's life and crimes leave an indelible mark on the history of modern religious institutions. His story is a stark reminder that spiritual authority must never be immune to scrutiny, and that institutional loyalty should never override the protection of the vulnerable. While the legionaries of Christ continue their work today, the shadow of Maciel's actions serves as a haunting lesson. Faith can inspire both immense good and profound harm when power is left unchecked. Paul Richard Shanley was once a respected figure in Boston's Catholic community, renowned for his work with at-risk youth and his outspoken advocacy on social issues. Born in 1931 in Boston, Massachusetts, Shanley entered the priesthood in the mid-1950s after completing studies in theology and philosophy, embarking on what many assumed would be a lifetime of pastoral care and spiritual leadership. His early assignments involved working with children and families in urban parishes, where he built a reputation for being approachable, compassionate, and attentive to troubled youth. By the 1970s, Shanley had become a vocal presence in the Boston Archdiocese, speaking at public events and contributing to progressive causes within the church. He often championed marginalized communities and argued for reform within church structures. His eloquence, persuasive preaching, and media presence allowed him to cultivate influence both inside and outside the Catholic hierarchy. Parishioners and colleagues regarded him as a forward-thinking cleric committed to social justice and youth outreach. However, behind this public image lay a disturbing pattern of behavior that would later shatter both his reputation and the lives of many young people. Allegations of sexual misconduct involving minors began surfacing, though at the time, church authorities largely dismissed or suppressed these reports. Shanley was reassigned multiple times over the years, moving between parishes, schools, and administrative roles, a practice that the Boston Archdiocese later acknowledged enabled continued abuse. Investigations revealed that Shanley had used his position of trust to exploit his access to children under the guise of pastoral care and mentorship, taking advantage of institutional authority and social influence to conceal his actions. During the 1980s and 1990s, multiple victims began to come forward, reporting sexual abuse that had occurred decades earlier. The allegations included grooming behaviors, manipulation, and assault, all facilitated by Shanley's role as a trusted priest. The Boston Globe's investigative series, which exposed widespread sexual abuse and cover-ups within the church, highlighted Shanley as a central figure in the crisis. Former parishioners, school staff, and social workers corroborated that the church hierarchy had ignored red flags and failed to protect vulnerable children, allowing Shanley's misconduct to persist. In 2002, Shanley was finally arrested and charged with multiple counts of child rape and indecent assault. The legal proceedings were complex as they involved decades-old allegations, testimonies from victims who had waited years to report their experiences, and extensive church records. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence that Shanley had exploited his position for sexual gratification, using manipulation, threats, and the veneer of religious authority to maintain control over his victims. Survivors recounted the emotional and psychological impact of his actions, describing how their trust in both Shanley and the church had been violated. Shanley's defense argued that the allegations were exaggerated or unreliable due to the passage of time. However, the consistency of multiple victim testimonies, corroborating documents, and church records established a compelling case against him. In 2005, a Massachusetts court convicted Shanley on several counts of indecent assault and rape of a child. He was sentenced to 12 to 15 years in prison, marking one of the highest-profile convictions resulting from the Boston clergy sexual abuse scandal. The conviction had profound implications beyond the courtroom. For the victims, it represented acknowledgement and validation of decades of trauma. For the Catholic Church, it forced a national reckoning about systemic failures in protecting children and addressing misconduct. The case catalyzed widespread reforms, including mandatory reporting policies, increased transparency in clerical assignments, and the establishment of compensation funds for victims. The Shanley case became emblematic of the intersection between institutional authority, religious trust, and abuse of power, illustrating how one individual, shielded by hierarchy, could exploit faith for predatory purposes. While incarcerated, Shanley's actions and convictions continued to provoke public debate. Some former supporters attempted to defend his character, citing his early advocacy and community work. But these perspectives were largely overshadowed by the overwhelming evidence of his misconduct and the voices of survivors. His release in 2017, after serving the majority of his sentence, did not erase the lasting damage inflicted on his victims or the broader community. Psychologists, theologians, and sociologists have since analyzed Shanley's case to understand the mechanisms of institutional abuse. Studies emphasize the importance of accountability, independent oversight, and transparency in religious organizations, highlighting that charismatic authority without checks and balances creates an environment where abuse can flourish. Shanley's story serves as a cautionary tale, reminding communities that moral authority does not guarantee moral behavior, and that safeguarding vulnerable populations must always take precedence over reputation or institutional loyalty. For the Catholic faithful and society at large, the Shanley case reinforced the painful truth that trust in religious leadership can be exploited when oversight is insufficient. Survivors, now adults, continue to speak publicly, advocate for stricter protections, and support reforms aimed at preventing similar abuses in the future. The case remains a defining moment in the broader movement toward accountability and healing within religious institutions, illustrating the human cost of power wielded without restraint. Reflection. Paul Shanley's life and fall underscore the dangers inherent when spiritual authority goes unchecked. It is a story of trust betrayed, lives altered, and institutions forced to confront uncomfortable truths. For those seeking guidance from spiritual leaders, the case offers a stark reminder. Faith should inspire safety, not fear. Guidance should protect, not harm. The lessons learned from Shanley's conviction continue to resonate today, emphasizing vigilance, transparency, and the necessity of listening to those who speak up against abuse. For more real-life crime stories and deep investigations into the world behind closed doors, subscribe now and stay connected for our next full exposé.